Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for joining to our monthly water program team webinar. Today, our speaker is Dr. Sabrina Drill. And Sabrina is a natural resource advisor for UC Cooperative Extension in Los Angeles and Ventura counties in the Southern California. And her focus is in natural resource management, restoration, habitat restoration, stream restoration, and invasive species management. Our work largely focus on underserved communities and trying to bring communities together in order to protect and preserve our natural resources. In terms of her academic background, she holds a PhD in geography and MS in biology, both from UCLA, and a BS degree in biology from Virginia Tech. She is a member of the steering committee for National Urban Extension Leaders and National Extension Climate Initiative. So join me in welcoming Sabrina. And today, the title of her presentation is Restoring the Los Angeles River for Ecosystems and People. So with that, Sabrina, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. And sorry for the technical difficulties earlier. Yeah, that's great, Ellen. You can go ahead. So I wanted to introduce the Los Angeles River a little bit for folks who might not be familiar with it. It is a highly urbanized river, at least in the lower parts, but the upper tributaries of the river are actually within Angeles National Forest. And for Southern California, in a relatively pristine condition, although there's a series of dams, check dams and things within the forest. Can you click again? So as I said, the upper watershed looks like a Southern California stream, probably has for thousands of years, runs through fairly high gradient areas, draining the San Gabriel Mountains. Next slide. But the LA River has been modified greatly by the presence of dams. The upper image there is Sepulveda Dam, and the lower image is just showing you sort of what our channelization looks like in the river. Next slide. Okay, so there's actually, I'll be talking a lot about the natural bottom section in Glendale, in the Glendale Narrows and in the Long Beach area. But then as you get to the very mouth of the Los Angeles River, it empties into the largest port complex in the world if you combine the ports of Los Angeles and the port of Long Beach, which are right next to each other there. Next slide. So the river is actually slated for approximately, depending on what happens, $2 billion restoration project. This is joint funding from the City of Los Angeles, the State of California, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the goals of that effort are to restore connectivity and urban parkland. Next slide, or next click. This shows you some of the recreational areas and parks within the LA River watershed and some of the activities people do in the river. But a lot of these efforts to kind of bring people to the river and explore how it can be turned from a channelized storm drain into an urban amenity, next click, please, are pushing a sort of green gentrification boom in the river. And I'll be talking more about a lot of these issues as we go through. Next slide. So just again, to give you sort of an idea of the physical geography, and I'm a fish biologist by background, so I'm not going to get in a lot to the topography or the underlying geology, but just looking at habitats. The upper watershed is cool and fast flowing, high oxygen, and it's got perennial water, which for those of you in other parts of the state, maybe many of your rivers always have perennial water, and that sounds normal. It's not the normal state of affairs in a lot of our Southern California watersheds. Hang on just a minute. I'm going to kick my dog's toy away. This background noise. Over there. Okay. Dogs and children today. It has a well-developed riparian canopy, and the substrate is gravel. And there are in-stream boulders, a lot of large woody debris, and undercut banks. So it's pretty high quality fish habitat for native California, Southern California species. Next slide. As we get further down into the watershed, it really changes form to be an alluvial fan river. So the San Gabriels are relatively high mountains. And it's not maybe what most people think of, high mountains, when they think of Los Angeles. I'm sure they're lovely and snow-covered now. But as you move down, it becomes a alluvial stream with sandy and gravelly substrates. So we have a lot of underground flow, low velocity streams. It's an intermittent stream. There's off-stream pools and high algae cover, and often not a well-developed riparian canopy. It's kind of a spread stream that multiple channels. Next slide. So when we think about what habitat should be in different parts of Los Angeles River, that's a complicated question, right? And it's one of the issues that restoration ecology really needs to think about is, who gets to make these decisions about what ought to be there if you're doing restoration? Do we want to go back to historic conditions? So a Mediterranean stream with very high sediment loads. Again, the San Gabriels are a young mountain range, rapidly eroding, and really a lot of disturbance. So this is, in Mediterranean climates, almost all of our rainfall happens over, say, a 6-week period in the winter, very dry otherwise. So we've got floods, we've got droughts, we've got fires, a lot of different things going on in the watershed prior to colonization. We've got the physical realities of the watershed now. We have built up most of that natural broad floodplain. So this is a river that would have swapped channels. There were years when it drained out of Bayona Creek, which is kind of to the near where it says Santa Monica. There's a blue circle and a green circle there. And then it would jump sometimes over to the San Gabriel Channel. The LA alluvial plain was probably in wet years a broad delta system dominated by different kinds of wetland habitats. But we've built on most of it. We have a population, it's the most populous county in the United States, about 10 million people living within the watershed now. So we have to balance out human needs for water storage, for quality water, for flood attenuation, and for recreation. Next slide. So, here's the numbers I was reaching for before. So there's about 4 million people in the city of Los Angeles, but 10 million in the county, probably more than that actually. 14 million in the metropolitan area, which includes 88 separate cities. So think about sort of when you're dealing with governments along the watershed, how many different competing priorities there might be. And it's really dense, about 7,000 people per square mile. It's highly ethnically diverse. There's 224 languages spoken in the county of Los Angeles, although English and Spanish do dominate. And there is actually a lot of open space in the watershed, 1,400 square miles of open space, but almost all of that is in federal land. And so it's not like that is distributed well throughout the watershed. The upper watershed is open space, but the lower watershed is very, very densely developed. Next slide. And you can go to the next slide as well. So one of the things that I've been doing is studying fishes in the LA River. And just to give you, again, a little bit of background, these are a list of some of the native fishes to the LA River. Click, please, Ellen. So what's within the red box there are fishes, cold water adapted fishes that are no longer, that are extirpated from the LA River, although some of them do exist, like unarmored three-spined stickleback and Santa Ana sucker, arroyo chub, and the speckled dace do all exist in other watersheds in the region. Next slide. Then we have some species that we commonly find in the river that are estuarine species that are used to brackish water. California killifish sort of less so. So I think I refer to it later as a freshwater species. And there's other estuarine species certainly that we could catch down there. And then next slide. And I'll talk a little bit more about steelhead and rainbow trout, which are the same species, different life histories, but the same species, Oncorhynchus micus. Next slide. So just a little bit more. So Omycus is can exist as an anadromous species, and that form is called steelhead. So anadromous meaning that they return to freshwater habitats to spawn, and that's where fry and juveniles start to develop. They move down to the estuary and further develop, then head out into ocean areas for a period of growth and maturation, and then head back to freshwater streams to spawn again. I'll just note that with steelhead, generally they seem to prefer their natal streams, but they're not nearly as sort of strict about that as some northern Pacific salmon that we think about. Next slide. So if you think about a steelhead in the LA River, and that's something that we talk about a lot, is could we bring steelhead back to the LA River? This is sort of the experience they would have. Click, please. So first they have to make it through, again, the largest port complex in the world. Next slide. Then miles and miles of completely channelized river with no hint of native vegetation or a native substrate. Next slide. Then they have a few areas. This is the Glendale Narrows I referred to before. We call these the soft bottom areas. And basically when they were, this is an area where the underlying bedrock is really close to the surface. And when they were channelizing the LA River, they didn't have the technology at that time to de-water these areas. So they left them unchannelized on the bottom. And that means they can support some in-stream vegetation and the development of islands and almost a braided channel-like system that you'd see in these streams naturally. But the sides are usually concrete, not riprap, but completely concrete, but sloped channels. Next slide, or click again. Then you get more of just channelized stuff. Next slide, or next click. Then you get to, if you're trying to go up, say well, you'll get to a dam no matter what. This is Devil's Gate Dam along the Arroyo Seco, which is a major tributary to the east side of the watershed into the San Gabriels. Next slide, or next click. Then you actually get to some nice upper watershed habitat that could be appropriate spawning habitat for salmonids. And last click, and then you get to the natural limit to upstream migration with some waterfalls. Next slide. So what did we want to find out to inform some of these restoration possibilities? We wanted to find out what fish are actually in the river right now. And so we've been conducting fish surveys in the river since about 2008. In various points throughout. So there's a couple different studies that these are put into. And actually I'm compiling all the data into one paper that I'm working on right now. And I'll talk more about this. So survey methods, traditional fishery survey methods with, block nets and seines and spot poles. Occasionally we tried using fish traps, and we didn't catch a lot this way, in part, because naturally it would be a very rocky bottom, in part because, click again. This is what the substrate of the LA River looks like now. So a combination of rocks and trash and other things. The other problem is probably that carp are a little too smart to be caught in these nets, especially when we can only pull them fairly slowly. So we wanted to try angling. Next slide. But like many fish biologists, not all, some are excellent anglers. I am not, and a lot of our team were not. So we needed to engage the community. And this actually provided us with a really great opportunity to both collect data, establish recreational opportunities along the river, and really engage with the community in thinking about what kind of river they want to see. So we had both volunteer field days that we organized that were focused on scientific data collection, as well as fishing derbies, where we also collected data, and there were events like, teaching kids to fish and how to tie a fly and all that kind of good stuff. I'll also note one neat thing about fishing in the LA River in those soft bottom sections. If you're learning to cast, as you're looking towards the river, you see like trees and rocks and fish jumping, and it looks like a real river. But behind you, there is nothing to snag your line on. So it's a great place to practice your casting. Next slide. And we also created an iNaturalist project, which is, iNaturalist is a platform for citizen science projects. We know people are fishing in the Los Angeles River. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And this was an opportunity for them to give us information because, a lot of people aren't fishing during Saturday mornings or when we're out collecting data. They're fishing in the evenings, maybe at night, maybe at dawn. So this allows us to collect a lot of data from the community when it's convenient for them, not just when we have these events organized. Next slide. And here's our raw data. I don't really expect you to look through this, but this is just, the results of many, many years of surveying in the river. And just to sort of sum this up, we found 18 different taxa. 14 of them are non-native. 3 of the native ones are those estuarine species I talked about, and 1 freshwater native, although killifish can kind of handle pretty brackish water. They're sort of a transitional species. In a sense, it's a healthy, large population. We didn't see a lot of signs of illness or tumors or parasitism in the fish that we were looking at, certainly no more than in any other river. We've caught a lot of fish, and we saw a lot more fish when we were out there, but there's few native species. So what we're seeing here is the cold water native species are gone. They're sort of losing out competitively to predominantly warm water species from Asia, Africa, the southeastern US, South America, various places. Next slide. So we wanted to go in and look and see if we could think more about the temperature profile in the river. So we set up temperature loggers at a number of different sites throughout the watershed. And what we found, not too surprisingly, is that in a lot of the main stem, the water is what we would call hot, over 30 degrees Celsius. Other areas we called warm if they were between 24 and 29 degrees. And there were only a few cold areas in the watershed. Again, they were in the upper watershed. This is where temperatures were below 24 degrees. And I'll sort of talk about the biological relevance of these temperatures in a minute. One interesting thing, Ellen, do you see the little sort of blue thermometer around 5C on the map itself? Yeah, so that was really interesting to find cold water there. There's a lot of springs at the confluence between Compton Creek and the Los Angeles River. Compton Creek, again, is highly channelized in most parts, but there's a soft bottom section of that as well. And so we think there was actually some connectivity to cooler groundwater in this area. Next slide. Oh, sorry. You didn't need to point those out. I did that too. Okay, next slide. Yeah, warm water throughout the center. Next slide. Yeah, keep going. So this kind of shows you what I'm talking about in terms of what this means biologically. So these are native species critical maximum temperatures for different species in the river, or that could have been found in the river. And what you can see is that in most points along the watershed, we're exceeding a lot of the thermal limits for these species a lot of the time throughout the spring and summer and even into fall months there. So dates are along the bottom and temperature is on the right. One interesting thing to point out, you see where it says O Micus low along that line? So about 24 degrees is considered to be the upper thermal temperature limit for steelhead. If you look through the literature, that's what it says everywhere. What we found, however, and actually it was Joe Check and Peter Moyle working at UC Davis did some experiments to find that Omicus could actually handle much higher temperatures if they were acclimated to these higher temperatures slowly. So that's the Omicus high right there is actually 32 degrees. And what we found is that southern steelhead, which is the subpopulation that we're working with in the Los Angeles area, actually seem to have a much higher temperature tolerance than the species does in other parts of its range. And one interesting thing to note about that is, you know, people sometimes think that Southern California should be written off in terms of restoring salmonids, that we should focus on these cold water areas. But as climate change tends to increase water temperatures throughout the state of California and all the way up the Pacific, we may be holding the genetic resource that has the capacity to adapt to those warming temperatures down in Southern California. So there's really a value for the species as a whole throughout its range of making sure we do what we can to see Southern California's steelhead persist. Next slide.
Wait, can I ask you a quick question? What are the different colors here? The 2B2C,
Oh, those are
different years or something?
No, those are our different sites. And I should have updated the slide because this was actually from our data analysis, not from the paper we finally published. But those correlate to the different points you saw on the map.
Okay, gotcha.
This is all over 1 year. The temperature requirements for native species are from the literature. The temperature observations are all from 1 year, 2016, I believe.
Okay, cool, thanks.
May through October. Next slide. So there's a number of really significant restoration challenges we can think of in the Los Angeles River. Certainly habitat fragmentation itself, and that can be through the direct impact of dams, certainly that's clear, but also these sort of velocity barriers that you have in channelized reaches of rivers. So, you know, trout and salmonids are tough, right? I mean, they have this life history where they're swimming upstream, and we've all seen videos of them doing these amazing jumps and swimming through these high velocity high velocity sections of rivers, jumping waterfalls. They can do that for bursts. They can't do it if there's no resting refugia areas. And that's what you get in a trapezoidal channel. So it may not be that the water velocities are such that a steelhead could never swim in it. They just can't consistently swim in it for the lengths they would need to reach upper watershed habitats, even if the dams were passable because they were removed or because we had fish ladders or because we had any one of the, you know, crazy systems that we use to get fish over dams in other rivers. Certainly water quality is an issue, although I will say that most of the year-round flow in the Los Angeles River is emissions from water treatment facilities. And while, you know, people get kind of grossed out by thinking about toilet to tap, those treatment facilities are held to very, very high water quality standards for their emissions. So water quality issues are really coming from the runoff, not from the treatment plant emissions. But one of the things that we've done in the LA River by switching to that system, you know, again, naturally we're a Mediterranean river. So we would have intermittent streams that would only have surface flow in the wettest times of year. We've messed all that up because the water treatment plants are receiving water from household use and from a lot of it from irrigation, right? And a lot of the runoff is coming from irrigation. So we have perennial flow in reaches of the river that would have been intermittent naturally. And that perennial flow is benefiting those non-native species. Non-native species themselves are an issue. There's the picture down to the bottom right is showing you how easy it is at any time of year to purchase a red-eared slider in Chinatown, which is right along the Los Angeles River. So we're consistent sources of non-native species. We've found some really interesting fish in there. You know, tropical fish who obviously were just released recently because they're going to die off, to, you know, carp, to tilapia, all kinds of different things. And of course, competing uses for the waterway itself, for the land that would have supported these broad floodplains, as well as for the water. And I'll be going into more detail on that. And then, of course, this elevated temperature. Next slide. So the elevated temperature, there's a number of reasons here. And by the way, I just stuck in this picture. I could have put it in later where I talk about recreational uses, but just want you to notice the horseback riding that happens in the LA River corridor. That may surprise some people when they think about LA. But the elevated temperature comes from the heat introduced to water through the water reclamation process, certainly, and just the concentration, it being out in pools, urban runoff and climate change, and the effect of impervious surfaces and all of the heat that's building up on the landscape as it's water's running over asphalt, et cetera. And then channelization, which has sort of three sub-elements to it. There's a loss of groundwater influence, and usually groundwater is much cooler than the surface water in these systems. There's a loss of shading because of the loss of riparian canopy cover, and the thermal mass of concrete itself. So the concrete channels are absorbing solar radiation and re-emitting it all night long. So we have these high temperatures persist over a 24-hour cycle. Next slide. And so one of the things, so the research that I just talked about is research that I've done personally as a PI or co-PI with a number of different colleagues at Cal State LA and the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains and a few other locations. But one of the things we're looking at is sort of the overall picture of the anticipated impacts of climate change on biological systems in the river, and we're developing models to sort of look at that. But I have to say that, you know, people really consider a lot of these other issues, like dam removal or the channel itself, or, you know, how much water we actually have to support fish. And it may be the temperature that is the most challenging to solve, especially as we move into, you know, having more high heat days and higher temperatures throughout the basin. The second study that I'll mention here is where we're looking at environmental flows and actually what's going on. So one of the byproducts of more water conservation and more interest in the use of reclaimed water for things like landscape irrigation is that we may lose flow in the Los Angeles River as more and more of this reclaimed water gets used for other uses. If, you know, eventually some of the irrigation water will come back to the watershed through runoff, but a lot will evaporate, and it's just really an altered system. So we're looking at you know, what kind of environmental flows we might need to try to retain or support in the watershed if we do want to support certain habitat conditions. And these two studies are actually led by the Southern California Coastal Waters Research Project, and I'm just an advisor on those. Next slide. The other thing that's going on is there's a study that's being led by Stillwater Sciences, and, a consulting firm, and US Bureau of Rec, to look at how we could design modifications to low flow channels to support habitat and fish passage, and where we can do things like removing dams. And there's you know, an artist rendering of what that might look like if we alter the low flow channels and provide more heterogeneity in the substrate. That's going to provide more heterogeneity in flow. These are interesting studies. I have to say that amongst my sort of fisheries and LA River restoration colleagues in in the county, we have a lot of mixed views, and I'm a little skeptical about bringing Steelhead back naturally to the LA River, but other folks are more hopeful than me, so it's something we'll continue to debate. Next slide. And a couple of other studies that I wanted to mention. The city of Los Angeles has been engaged in a really interesting study to develop a biodiversity index specific to Los Angeles. It's basically a modification of the Singapore Index for urban biodiversity. And I worked again as an advisory team member on that project. And actually this is not focused on just aquatic habitat. And I was surprised they needed to do a lot. I'm glad I spent the time to really go through it with a fine-tooth comb, because they needed to do a lot to think about how to measure the quality of aquatic habitats. And the second project, which is actually out for public review right now, is the LA River Master Plan. And this is a master plan being developed at the behest of the LA County Flood Control District. So flood control is certainly one of the primary interests guiding how we deal with the Los Angeles River. They hired one of our most well-known LA-based architects, Frank Gehry and Associates, to work on this master plan. I'm in the process of reviewing it right now. I am disappointed to find a lack of creative solutions to how we might be able to provide multiple benefits in the watershed, but we'll sort of see how things go after the public review process has occurred. Next slide. But thinking about what we want the LA River to be leads us to this question about who the LA River is for. So there's been a lot of effort. They established a couple of years ago a new recreation zone in the upper western side of the watershed near Sepulveda Basin, where kayaking can occur, and it can also occur in the Glendale Narrows section that I spoke about before. There's fishing. There is a bikeway that's not completely complete, but you can, with a few detours, you can bike from Pasadena to Long Beach, mostly along the Los Angeles River, and there's still work being done to bring that together. There's the development of 2 new historic state parks along the Los Angeles River, and the center picture there is the visitor center at one of these. There is art going on along the river. That water wheel rendering is a large public art project that was approved but is now somewhat on hold, that was going to be built by the artist Lauren Bond and Metabolic Studios. She's one of the heirs to the Annenberg sort of dynasty, so there's a lot of money to put behind this. Also an image there, the little GIF. I don't know if any of you other guys are fans of our LA-based hip hop scene. That's Kendrick Lamar, sort of showing you an example of how we have utilized the LA River in films and music videos and television throughout time. And then to the bottom right is, trying to build up restaurants and music venues along the river as well. Next slide. This is actually just an example that I wanted to share. A group of artists created a card deck that you could get your hands on, the physical format, or there's a digital deck that works, there's an app that goes with it. It works really well. There's 56 cards in the deck. So in theory, you could spend every weekend and more exploring different parts of the Los Angeles River. But I wanted to point out, so there's a blow up of one of the cards here, the First Street Bridge adjacent zone, that I think kind of typifies issues with this question of who the LA River is for. If you look down to the bottom right, they have a little sort of measurement scheme that goes from gritty to green. I think there's some real questions about using the term gritty to describe neighborhoods that house a lot of the riverside populations in the Los Angeles River. They also have on here, all the cards are in English. A lot of the programming that I talked about is only available in English. They also have an example here of, here's a good place to try out your Mexican hat dance. Next slide. But what we find populations who are truly living both along and in the river, primarily using the river for, is fishing. So I mentioned some of the fishing derbies that we've held. We've also observed all kinds of things. The gentleman holding up the carp in sort of the bottom central photo there, he was fishing with a cast net. I have never seen someone fish with a cast net in an urban river like this in the United States. So that was really interesting to come upon. We talked to him a little bit. He was a fairly recent immigrant from Guatemala, where this was a really common fishing technique, where he originally came from before immigrating to Los Angeles. And then the pictures over to the right are from a study that a colleague of mine, Jason Post, led and just recently published about fishing in the Los Angeles River, where he noted a lot of opportunities where likely homeless populations were fishing in the river as a supplementary and important protein source, and also just low income Angelenos. And it's, it's hard to know from some of these videos whether people are eating the fish or not, but certainly from surveys that we've done, there are a fair number of people who are consuming these exotic fish. Next slide. Oh, wait. And then there's the whole issue of gentrification right along the river. So I kind of, alluded to that when I showed the photos of who the river was for. Excuse me, I have to yell at my dog for a moment. Okay, sorry about that. She was trying to jump on the stove where we cooked some steaks last night. So, a lot of what the city sees in efforts to quote unquote restore the Los Angeles River, which I think they very astutely are calling river revitalization, because it's not just about ecological restoration. They're hoping that it can be a financial driver for the city and for redevelopment of these corridors. So there's a lot of lofts being built along these areas in the Los Angeles River. I alluded to, there's a brewery now in this Frogtown area of the river, and it's really displacing some populations who are no longer able to afford homes in the same neighborhoods that they may have grown up in or lived in for generations. Oh, and just note there, it's gentrification and gentrification. It's not always, all white communities coming in, but it's higher income communities. Next slide. I just wanted to mention that Jason Post and I actually have a chapter in a forthcoming Routledge handbook where we really try to weave together these different narratives about geography and ecology and utilization and social justice in the river. So look for that if you're interested in reading more. Next slide. And I also wanted to talk about some of the extension programming that we've done to try to see if we can have some increases in the community voices that are able to effectively take part in environmental decision-making processes. So a couple of examples of some projects I've worked on, the California Naturalist Program, which is a volunteer training program. Well, not just volunteer, it's a training program for for people who are not professional scientists who want to get involved in natural resource stewardship and research. And in most cases, these master naturalist programs, which exist throughout the country, are aimed at volunteers. One of the things that we started to do is work with groups like conservation corps and use this California naturalist training as part of their onboarding, so that when they finish their core service and are seeking, or potentially seeking careers or seeking to further their education in the environmental field, they're leaving with a UC credential and actually 4 units of credit provided through UC Davis Extension. We also worked on a project that I'm hoping I can expand on over the next few years to develop an English language acquisition curriculum, working with an ESL program at one of our local community colleges to develop a curriculum about watersheds in Los Angeles. It covers both the San Gabriel and the Los Angeles River. But I really had found that, being able to just simply translate things at a community meeting doesn't mean you're going to get effective input from non-English speaking populations. People are often more able to effectively articulate what they want and have it influence environmental decision-making processes if they can articulate that in English and if they can understand the information being presented to them in English. Now, when I first started working on this project, I had people say, oh, recent immigrants aren't interested in environmental issues. And it turned out that was far from the truth. We actually published a paper, Journal of Extension, about some of the survey data we had. And I'll just to briefly, perhaps the most poignant thing that we heard is for ESL teachers, getting their students to argue with each other is like the gold standard, because when people have to use their new language to talk about something that they're really fired up about, it really presses them to work on their language skills. I was working with East LA College, which sits at the nexus between East LA, which is predominantly Hispanic, and Monterey Park, which is predominantly Chinese. So these were mixed language classes where they couldn't just go back to arguing in their original language. And they were finding that, yes, there were poor, fisher folk or people who didn't have access to clean water in their country of origin who emigrated to the US to see that, all the way up to, people who had formerly been water engineers. And people really did care quite a bit when they had sort of the language and the entree to talk about it, because there's only so many times you can talk about how to find the library. I don't know if you guys had that experience in any language class you've taken, but I did. The last thing I'll mention is Watershed University, where we develop an entire course around a specific watershed aimed at preparing diverse communities for stakeholder-driven watershed management planning. Because a lot of times it's engineering departments who are tasked with developing a stakeholder process for watershed management. They don't have the skills to do it, and the people who need to be in that room talking about their diversity of interest don't have the skills to talk to each other. They don't have a common language, and that's really the goal of Watershed U. And we've done Watershed U's in Arroyo Seco in the upper watershed, as well as in Compton Creek down in the lower watershed. Next slide, which I think is my last. Yep, with that, I'll take any questions you have, and just wanted to thank the huge range of colleagues who participated in this research. Those are sort of the larger names to the left and or supported or gave technical advice to the research. Okay, I'm a little starstruck right now to see Joe Check clapping for me. Wow.
We need the
theology heroes.
Yeah, virtual clap. Yeah, thanks, Sabrina. This is really exciting and very interesting piece of work, and very relevant work, considering how much we have messed up with our landscape, urban or non-urban, all the same. Yeah, so folks, if you have questions, if you are from UC, feel free to just ask directly. Otherwise, put the question in the chat, and Alan and I will be happy to read, because we are recording this webinar. And if you don't want to be recorded and put up on the YouTube, then the chat might be the better option. But to get started, Sabrina, a couple of questions for you. Do you know if the dam that you showed, I can't remember the name, if they have any temperature control there that they can regulate? No? No,
well, at Sepulveda Dam and Hansen Dam, which are the two large Army Corps dams. Now, note that none of these are hydropower dams. These are all primarily for flood management and to control debris as it comes down from these watersheds. It's possible there's some temperature regulation at Sepulveda. Definitely not at Devil's Gate Dam on the Arroyo Seco, which is what I showed you, which is really interesting because they're right next to JPL. So you'd think if there was a place to test out instrumentation, you know, if there was a better place, but I don't believe that they do.
I mean,
Then
I
how,
had a,
then,
yeah, sorry,
so
Sujeet. I had a question on similar lines, but go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to follow up. So how are they complying with the biological opinion? Just through water? Releasing more
Oh, the
water?
biological opinion for steelhead?
Yeah.
Steelhead are not, it's really tricky. So technically portions of the LA River are part of the critical habitat for steelhead, but steelhead are not considered to be present in the watershed below any of the dams.
Got it.
There's rainbow trout in the upper watershed. There's also a long history of stocking up there. So it's a little hard, although recent studies, Carlos Garza's group, NIMPS research group, has found that there's native trout genotypes up there. Certainly up in the San Gabriel River, that's true, which is sort of the neighboring watershed over, but there's not considered to be any steelhead below the watershed. Every once in a while, we get a fish, you know, found way down in the lower watershed trying to work its way up, but we don't find anything consistent. We actually had a Chinook a few years ago show up in the mouth of the LA River, but
Good,
didn't
thanks.
have much of a chance to migrate anywhere.
Sabrina, I mean, you had talked about how, like the importance of temperature though. So I guess like, could you elaborate on like how you would try to control temperature? Like what are some of the biggest drivers of the temperature and how in a restoration project could you influence that?
It's a good question. So I did discuss some of the drivers of the temperature. It's really a combination of the fact that this is mostly runoff and reclaimed water that's being heated as it's moving through the watershed, along with that separation from cooler groundwater because of the channelization, including in most of the river, you know, complete channelization along the substrate. As well as just that amount of concrete itself. I've been trying to get some engineers to go in and study that in more detail, but there's got to be, you know, some impact of that. If money was available, I suppose cooling, you know, the most effective thing to do would be cooling water before it's released from those water reclamation plants. The other thing would be to restore shading, you know, to remove some of those concrete banks or modify them to increase vegetation. Now, there's a lot of talk about the banks. There are areas where they've created diversions. I think there are areas where we could probably look at actually removing concrete and restoring some direct connectivity to the floodplain through the Elysian Park area of the river, and again near Southgate and actually in Compton Creek as well. But a lot of the other plans are looking at things like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Chongqichan River in Seoul, which is a good example of where they brought back an urban river for, you know, for a combination of different reasons, but it's certainly serving as a cultural amenity. And they did sort of this stepped pattern along the concrete banks so that people could at least access the river and sit down there and stuff. Really mixing in a lot of vegetation there to increase shading would be good. And potentially, you know, if you could run the water, perhaps pumping it through constructed treatment wetlands, you could both improve water quality and potentially cool it down that way.
Yeah, I mean,
otherwise, I'm looking for ideas. I am not an engineer.
Yeah, I mean, and it also seems like increasing vegetation could also increase recreational value, potentially. I mean, depending on people's preferences for like shade while they're fishing or, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, it seems like a win-win type of thing. So,
yes, but as you know, if you've worked with any flood control engineers, they don't want anything messing with that channel capacity.
Yeah, that makes
So,
sense.
and a lot of this is about, is there a better way to not sort of make these permanent year-round decisions, but have more flexibility so that we can have, say, off-channel storage during flood flows? You know, we talked about like floodable ball fields.
Mm,
There's a lot of golf courses actually right along the Los Angeles River that could potentially be flooded, because we're talking about, again, like a 6 or 8 week period where there can be very significant rainfall. I mean, certainly in El Nino years, we see a lot of rain. I've started looking at working with a team who's looking at atmospheric river impacts. So we can certainly see really, you know, devastating floods, and did in the LA River. That's why it was channelized in the first place in the late 30s and 40s. But I think there are other ways to think about floodplain capacity and compatible uses,
mhm.
and have more flexibility throughout the year instead of just designing the entire watershed permanently for the
Yeah.
100-year flood event.
So there's a really interesting question in the chat about how changes in water flow might benefit native versus invasive fish populations. So the question is, if we do have reduced water flow due to conservation, et cetera, will that reduce invasive fish populations and improve the prospects for natives?
Maybe, again, if we can get that water down. So some of the species that we think about, that, you know, there's a lot of species that wouldn't be able to survive these intermittent flows. They don't have, so, you know, in addition to steelhead, there's a lot of other species that have intra-watershed migrations, especially in these kinds of streams that are naturally intermittent in their alluvial lower floodplain portions. And a lot of these exotic species wouldn't have the behaviors or the flexibility to handle that. It's really, you know, one of the things that makes California so biodiverse is its high levels of disturbance that allow, that really foster survival of species that are adapted to that. And we are making conditions better for these exotics. So potentially, I guess, if we had dewatering, that would be one piece of the puzzle, but without addressing temperature impacts, the lack of flow is likely to further increase water temperatures.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, Sabrina, in terms of the water temperature on those lined, you know, portion of the river, have you looked at the diurnal pattern and see whether the natural, you know, substrate channel is heating and cooling differently than all the concrete portion, or they all look the same?
We haven't yet, and that would be really interesting to look at. But remember that even the quote unquote natural portions of the lower river still have these huge concrete walls. Right? So I suspect that if we could have temperature data from, you know, 150 years ago, we'd see less diurnal variation throughout the entire watershed than we would have had then.
Yeah. Any more last minute questions, thoughts? Because we're at the hour right now. If not, then let's just give a round of applause to Sabrina, virtual applause. Thanks for taking the time and talking to us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks
Right.
very much, Sabrina. I learned a lot. Bye, everybody.
Right.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone. See you next
Bye.
month.